Hello everyone, welcome to the Vineyard. This is going to be a one-off build, so there will be no series attached to it formally. If for some reason I get inspired, I may go back to it, but my intention for this was to create a complete build in one episode. A lot of my inspiration for this build was Northern Italy. With the release of all the region packs, I felt inspired to do something outside of the US. Although, with all the wonderful videos already showcasing the new assets, I wanted to do something a little bit more unique. The general area of this build also allows me to spend some time detailing up all of our natural areas and rivers that will be interweaving through the build, and I love getting a chance to make some natural scenery, especially after spending so much time in cities. I'm continuing to try to narrow down the visual identity of this area. I want to line the streets with these large bushes. I'm using lots of poplar trees and the occasional oak tree. Later on, you'll see me use apple trees and chestnut trees as well. I think all of these just sort of fit the vibe and aesthetic that I'm going for. Here I start laying out some dirt paths that just wind their way around the vineyards, providing separation and a little bit more visual interest. I assume they are also used for farmers to access the different fields. I want to make one distinction that this definitely isn't a large-scale industrial sort of setup. I took a lot of creative liberties, and due to the small scale that I'm building on, I wanted to go for a more natural and homely setup. I obviously want some amount of realism in the build, but at the end of the day, realism was not the number one priority. I was mainly just focusing on making it look visually appealing. As you can see, when I start placing these by hand, it opens up so many possibilities for interesting shapes and patterns. I can narrow down that balance between uniformity and variation. And by the way, I'm using poplar saplings that are lowered 1.5 meters into the ground for these vines. I experimented with lots of different things, and this was my favorite, both in color and in shape. We're not just building vineyards, by the way. We're going to be building a small town, some houses scattered about, and incorporating a river that runs through all this area. And so, we can see that the visual identity is already being quickly defined as we go through. I'll be removing these ugly uniform bushes that I put down in the start, and we'll be moving on to other elements shortly. For now, I'm going to leave you with some music, and I'll be back to talk about key points. You can see we got this stream running all the way from the mountain to the larger river downstream. I've spent some time detailing up this section of the river. I really wanted to make the water features stand out, as they are a big part of this build. I use the rubble props as a base, then go in with bushes and the bigger boulders. You'll see I lower a lot of bushes into the ground at varying heights too, to get more variation in the greenery. Then the trees go down and it starts looking so alive. Here, I've just put down some fences. I think the fences add a lot. And I'm just now going through and creating another vineyard with the same sort of ideas that we laid down in the beginning of the video, except this time it's going to be all natural and none of that line usage that makes it so monotonous looking. I like the idea of using this wooden bridge as a centerpiece of sorts. Obviously, once we have the town down, that will also serve as a centerpiece, but this area is looking great and it is very centrally located within the build. This is another key, I suppose, that I can use as a reference point for how I want all of the other areas to look like. Here I start using a little bit of those chestnut trees and apple trees, and they really do just provide that sort of Mediterranean, northern Italy aesthetic that I'm looking for. I'm not sure if, these are the exact type of trees that you would find there, but the coloring of the leaves and the shape and the size and everything like that, it all just sort of has this Mediterranean feel to it to me. And so I really liked finding those trees and incorporating those into the map. And so I was surprised how far I could get with this idea, just being creative and working with what I had. Because whenever I recorded this, actually, I think by the time I was getting done with this build, the French packet came out already. So I was very much just working with what I had at the moment. By the time I was done with this build, the French packet came out, and I did try to incorporate some of the buildings into this save, and for some reason, it just completely broke the save, and I almost lost the entire map. And so once I was able to fix it, I was just like, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna hold off on the French assets for now, and we'll figure it out later. So that's sort of what happened there. And I guess that's another commentary on sort of the state of trying to push this game to the limits, because by the time I'm done with this map, I have placed down thousands of poplar trees all in one concentrated spot, and tons of bushes and tons of rubble props and tons of things that shouldn't really be as concentrated as they are. And I notice whenever I try to push City Skylines to the limits, it definitely pushes back. And so I was dealing with a lot of crashes and a lot of interesting errors. I know I started placing decals down at one point, and every time I'd close the game and go back into the save, the decals had switched over to something completely different, or they had just gone invisible or something like that. Definitely seems like there are some limitations with some of these things, and I think they might just have to do with the fact that the asset functionality is not official yet. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on any of these things, but I do notice that there are some issues, and I think everybody else notices that as well. But I like to focus on the positive sides of things, and you know what? I got this build out, and it looks really good, or at least it looks, how I wanted it to look, and I'm proud of it. So right here, we're just going through and doing more of these vineyards. You see I've separated them all out into their little chunks, and they've got dirt roads going through them and things like that. So I assume most of these will be worked by hand. There's not a whole lot of space for a tractor to get through in a lot of these areas. I'm not sure, what sort of technology they're using, but I think how I have it set up looks nice. And so I think that achieves my goal at that point. I love doing these little, sort of different shapes and stuff, how I'm doing, a little bit of a swooping pattern into this area. Just kind of, whenever you zoom out and you see it all, it just gives it a little bit more of that visual interest whenever it has that unique shape. So, just filling all of this out. I think I put a little house here. I think that's what I'm about to do now, is go through and put just a house of whoever owns these fields, can live there, and they don't have to travel too far and whatnot. But it looks like we're placing down some of these electrical poles, which I think look really nice. So what I was trying to go for with the electrical poles is that I wanted to sort of avoid the trees, especially the oak trees, because I assume the oak trees are really old. They're these huge trees, And so I wanted it to make it look like the trees got here before the electrical lines did. And so they moved around the trees instead of just plowing through them, because I feel like a place like this would really hold a lot of stock in trying to conserve their natural scenery, especially these trees that that are several hundred years old, I would assume. And so that was sort of one of the small details that I added, was that the trees definitely got here before the electrical poles did. Here I'm just doing a little bit of a house, like I said earlier. We're just doing some little small props and assets here, just doing some tables here, a chair there. Just we got some sheds out there, they got to have tools, obviously. They're taking care of their vines and whatnot, so got to have some tools. He's using parasols. A lot of these are very much assets that I use all the time at this point. I'm starting to get very familiar with the amount of assets that we have in the game, the amount of props that we have in the game. And so whenever I'm making these now, there's less looking around for things and more just like, okay, I know exactly which chair I want, or I know exactly which table I want, because I've just spent so much time working with it. And already this is looking pretty nice, especially with the lighting that we have going on here. It was like sort of this I think it was like morning time perhaps that we're in right now. I really love messing with the lighting in the game. It just completely changes the visuals of the game depending on the time of day, and specifically the direction you're looking in. Because if you're looking in the same direction that the sun is shining, it's gonna look really pretty, because you're gonna have all of this, stuff that's being illuminated by the light, and then you'll have shadows behind it. But if you look in the direction of the sun, there's just so much shadow and so much darkness, but there's like barely any light. And so it's interesting how, if I'm like building from one direction, I'll want it to be afternoon, but if I'm building from another direction, I want it to be morning, because I'm trying to keep this sort of, I guess, visual identity with the lighting. And I've noticed that you can circumvent that a little bit by setting the clouds higher. If you have more clouds, there's less contrast in the lighting. I assume because the sun isn't beating down so extremely hard, because it has to dissipate through the clouds. And so I would urge you guys to experiment with, how you're doing your clouds, and experiment with the different settings of the time and day and stuff like that. And you can really get some interesting vibes going on. And so we're pretty much just finishing up the build at this point. I unfortunately lost the recording of me building up the town center area, and I know that's been kind of a reoccurring theme at this point with some of the videos that I've been making. I've been really bad about losing, some of my footage and stuff like that as I go on, so I really do apologize about that. But I'm going to be showing off a lot of cinematics and stuff like that of the town center, and so you'll be able to get a good look at it. There wasn't that much that went into it. I mainly just made little small grids just to be able to pack in as many houses as I can into a small area, and then I used pretty much exclusively motel assets. The motel assets have a very specific look to them, and I feel like they really fit the northern Italian theme of this build. And so, I got some really nice pastel colors in there, and I just kind of crammed a bunch of those motel assets in there. And then I went and removed all of the signs because, since they're commercial assets, they have a whole bunch of signs. And I kind of wanted them to look a little bit more residential. So that's basically all that I did. there were some small things that I unfortunately had to part with. At one point I added some textures on the streets, and every time I quit the game and loaded back in, they would be switched to a different texture, or they would be switched to they would just be corrupted in some way. So I ended up having to part with those textures, but I'm really happy with how the build turned out nonetheless, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. So that's gonna be it though. So I want to thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked the video, I would appreciate a like, and if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I should be doing, I want to do another episode of Angler Creek next, so hopefully you'll be seeing an episode of Angler Creek here soon. I'm going to be filling out some of the riverside areas with some more suburbs, and I really like some of the new assets that we got for low density residential, so I think it's going to turn out really nice with some of those new assets that we have. So definitely stay tuned for that, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.